everyone, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. I also want to remind everyone that proof of vaccination is required to attend this event. That's right. CUNY has announced that if you are not vaccinated, you can't watch this event. Seriously, 18 months into this pandemic, I hope everyone is staying safe. And while the Graduate Center at CUNY is now open for classes, we are not allowed to hold any public events in the auditoriums. So alas, this autumn semester, all our Leon Levy events will be on Zoom. Please note that our next event will be on October 19th at 6 p.m. when Ruth Franklin will moderate a roundtable discussion on the topic of scandalous biographers and their publishers. Participants will include Laura Marsh, Tim Dugan, Katha Pollitt, and Ian Baruma. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. Note that we have at least 10 events this autumn, a very full schedule, so please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. They'll then be reminded of each of these events. But tonight we are here to celebrate a new biography by Frances Wilson entitled Burning Man, The Trials of D.H. Lawrence. Wilson will be interviewed by our own Thad Ziolkowski, Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center. Please look for Burning Man at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Frances Wilson is a critic, a journalist, and the author of several works of nonfiction, including Literary Seductions, The Courtesan's Revenge, The Ballad of Dorothy Wordsworth, which won the Rosemary Crochet Prize, How to Survive the Titanic, winner of the Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography, and Guilty Thing, A Life of Thomas de Quincey, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and she received a fellowship from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center in 2018. She lives in London with her daughter. Thad Ziolkowski, Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center, is the author of the surf memoir, On a Wave, which was a finalist for the PEN Martha Albrand Award in 2003, Wichita, a novel, and The Drop, How the Most Addictive Sport Can Help Us Understand Addiction and Recovery, which was just published to critical acclaim by HarperCollins in July. His essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Slate, Book Forum, Art Forum, Travel and Leisure, Interview Magazine, and Index. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and has a PhD in English literature from Yale University. Frances Wilson and Thad Ziolkowski will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Thad will be sure to get to as many as he can. We'll try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And now I turn this conversation over to Thad. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. And welcome, Frances. Very excited
Hello.
to have you here.
It's great to be here.
I have your book in hand, Burning Man. And it's such an amazing book. It's such a great follow-up to the De Quincey, and I want to talk a little about that connection later. I mean, this is a book like De Quincey, like The Guilty Thing, that is about a writer. And I thought I would just begin by talking about something so obvious that a lot of people don't address it, which is the whole reason that we pay attention to, that we write literary biographies, is that they basically flow from a literary achievement. And Lawrence is many things, as you explore so brilliantly, but he was first and foremost a writer. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about your affinity for him in that respect, the sort of deep affinity that is necessary for a multi-year project such as this biography. You know, talk a bit about your experience of Lawrence on the page in the literary realm, and then the problem as a biographer of representing that sphere, the compositional hours, the revision, how he wrote, and so forth.
Yeah, that's a big question, Sad. I think first of all, I think most women of my generation have a very strong relationship to Lawrence on the page, and a very complex one, because those of us who came of age in the 1970s sort of were introduced to a very strange version of Lawrence. He had been the hero of female sexuality in the 60s, when the lady, during the kind of whole Lady Chatterley's unexpurgated kind of business was going on, Lawrence was seen as a man who kind of invented female orgasm on the page, if you like. And by the 1970s, you know, he was seen as the enemy of female sexuality. And so all women of my generation come to Lawrence feeling like, my God, you know, is he friend or foe? And I think that my relationship with him started off as a very contested one, and I wasn't entirely sure how to find my way into Lawrence through his writing. And I had no idea when I started this book who Lawrence was. And that's really what I wanted to kind of get across in the book, that the Lawrence we have, the Lawrence who has been handed down to us, mainly through Kate Millett and F.R. Leavis, is just a fraction of the Lawrence that everyone knew at the time. I mean, Lawrence, for example, was not known as a novelist. He was a man of letters, and you never knew what he was going to pull out of the hat next. It was rabbit after rabbit after rabbit. It was poetry, journalism, extraordinary criticism, like the study in classic American literature, the memoir of Maurice Magnus, you know, plays written in Nottingham dialect. He was a man who spoke many, many tongues, and he's been reduced to a man who had really just a mansplainer, if you like, a mansplainer on a soapbox, telling everyone what to think and that what they think is wrong. And so I wanted to kind of rediscover Lawrence on the page by looking at a whole different range of Lawrences. I wanted to look at the whole spectrum of Lawrences. And what I feel very strongly is that we have the canon wrong. Mm-hmm. That what's in the center of the Lawrence canon, you know, the few novels that F.R. Leavis put in the center of the canon should actually be on the periphery. And what's been put on the periphery should now be in the center. And I think we need different canons for different ages. But I feel at the moment that everyone's got a lot to say about Lawrence without knowing very much what he had to say to us.
Right, and it seemed like his appeal to you may have been there was a slight taboo, or you had the appeal of difficulty of rehabilitating him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he had been condemned to death by Millett in that essay in the 70s that you're alluding to. And so for you to, of all the subject matter, of all the writers or all the subjects for a biography you might have written, you turned to Lawrence, and some of the frisson of turning to Lawrence had to do with his having been condemned to death. And that struck you as unfair, perhaps?
It didn't strike me as unfair to begin with. I mean, when I started out on this book, you know, I'm a fan of Kate Millett. I'm incredibly impressed by her work. I don't think any PhD student has pulled off a coup like Kate Millett did in sexual politics. So I came to Lawrence thinking, you know, you and I have a date. We have a conversation. It's a conversation I've been wanting to have with you forever, but I've never been able to have because you were taken off the syllabus when I was at school. You were taken off the syllabus when I was at university. I couldn't read you at home because my mother, you know, thought that you were, well, it wasn't that my mother thought he was misogynist. My mother thought he was humorless. And that's why we weren't allowed to have Lawrence in the house. And so I felt, you know, he's been made so much more attractive to me for having been censored so much. So I thought when I came to him, you know, that I probably would have a fight. We'd have a fight on the page and see where it went. And then I realized very, very soon on that actually what he had to say about female sexuality was of so little interest to me, and of so little interest in general. And what he had to say about sex was of so little interest that we didn't even have any, it just didn't matter. It didn't matter. So that sort of evaporated. And all these other things came to the fore. And what the book is about. So if you're looking for a book that discusses Lawrence and sexuality, is not it.
Right, right. Well, one of the qualities of your work that I love is the sense of something having a kind of a mystery, or there's a kind of question that's driving it, a sense of forward motion, and a kind of, not exactly a puzzle that you're trying to solve, but a sense of urgency. That's what I loved about Guilty Thing, the De Quincey biography, and that's what I loved about this book too. And what was the question you were asking yourself, or what was creating that sense of urgency for you that you were able to kind of transmit to the atmosphere of the biography?
Well, I do bring a question to my biographies. In fact, each book is organized around a question, and whether that question is answered or not almost doesn't matter. It just has to hang there. And with Lawrence, the question was, why were you so angry? What were you so angry about? And that question sort of became many, many, many questions. But I think that was what I was trying to explore, was how a peaceable, adorable little boy, by all accounts, you know, was loved to pieces by his sisters and his mother and all his family friends, turned into this raging, sort of hate-filled monster of a man. So what happened? And that's what drove the narrative, and also what drove the narrative. I know what you mean about the kind of forward propulsion. I was very aware of that as I was writing, that I was kind of hurtling through it. I felt his urgency because he was dying. And you're always angry when you're dying, you know, and he had so little time left, and every year was a bonus for him, because he should have died as a teenager. He should have died in his 20s, he should have died in his 30s. It's amazing that he lived as long as he did. And so he was racing through life, kind of gulping it in. And I found myself racing through the writing, trying to enjoy every moment of him and his perceptions and his writing until he died.
And there was a turning point early on where he went for that kind of sweet Wordsworthian boy who had the girlfriend. What was her name? What was the girlfriend's name?
Jessie Chambers.
Jessie Chambers. The Jessie Chambers period, it's very heartbreaking to watch that dissolve. And I hadn't known that he was ever anything other than a kind of angry prophet. But that seemed to be a turning point. What happened between him and her that made him, was it connected to his awareness that he was dying of TB, or was that unconnected?
Well, Jessie Chambers, like everyone who ever knew Lawrence or ever spent kind of half an hour with Lawrence, she wrote a memoir about him. Lawrence's presence was so forceful, so powerful, that people just had to record it. And Jessie Chambers' memoir of Lawrence is a really, really powerful book, and I think it should be an appendix to Sons and Lovers. Every edition of Sons and Lovers should have Jessie Chambers' version of her role, because she appears as Miriam Levers in Sons and Lovers. But what she says in the memoir is there are two Lawrences, and she watched the first Lawrence turn into the second Lawrence. She met Lawrence as a teenager when Lawrence was born and raised in a colliery town, a mining town in Nottingham, and her family were farmers. And Lawrence loved to visit her family, and they saw him as joy personified. And together, Lawrence and Jessie Chambers kind of raided the local library, and they read everything. Maddox Ford said when he met Lawrence that he'd never met a man who had read so deeply into the dullnesses of 18th and 19th century literature. And so it's a kind of hymn really to the local library. And then Jessie said that when Lawrence was 19, his character completely changed. And she put this change down to his mother. And of course, everything with Lawrence goes back to his mother. Lawrence's mother said to him, you cannot continue this relationship with Jessie because people are going to talk. So you either have to marry her or drop her. And Lawrence suddenly felt completely blocked. He thought, well, I can't marry her because I'm married to you, mother, you know, and I can't. And then he realized that there was two of him because he couldn't love the person he desired. And he couldn't desire the person that he loved. And so he split himself off. He split the sexual side of him off from the other side. And he also then started to write himself about the difference between the writer in himself and the non-writer. And he said, you know, the part of me that writes has no relation to the part of me that lives. It's completely unconscious. And you realize this so this sort of answers your question really about Lawrence's writing process. And why I was drawn to Lawrence as a writer is because you're just watching an unconscious at work. Watching someone who just, he never had writer's block. He never experienced what the rest of us feel, staring at a page. He just felt his unconscious was very, very far up. Well, he wouldn't say it was far up in here, he'd say it was far up in the solar plexus because that's where he thought it was rooted. But that's what he wrote for, to release kind of repressed, unspoken language and thoughts. And so he was aware of a split between the Lawrence who wrote and the Lawrence who didn't write. And Jessie Chambers was aware of a split between Lawrence as a very sweet, empathetic, loving person, and Lawrence is a raging tyrant. And people who knew Lawrence after the age of 19 said, you never knew which one was going to turn up.
And some of the things that they read, and this was one of the bits of literary history that I love to read biographies for, was that Dante during that period. And that Dante, during the period of Lawrence's youth, was more widely known. My Dante, perhaps yours too, was through T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I thought of Dante as this very Mandarin taste and something that no one would read unless you had gone very far into literary culture. But the story of the Divine Comedy was widely known during the time of Lawrence's voracious reading. And one of the claims you make in the book that's so fascinating and helps structure it is that Lawrence says his movements during the period you write about were informed by the structure of the Divine Comedy. Yeah. Could you say a little bit about the importance of Dante and to him and to you in the book?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you say, Dante wasn't rarefied taste 100 years ago. Lawrence knew his Dante just in the same way that he knew his Bible. He knew it inside out. Lawrence and the modernists were all preoccupied with Dante. And I see Lawrence as a late romantic. And of course, the romantics were all completely preoccupied with Dante as well. Byron and Shelley were Lawrence's precursors, and they were totally absorbed in Dante. And so you couldn't be, and Lawrence saw himself, you have to remember, first and foremost, as a poet. He was published as a poet before he was published as a novelist. And his poetry was born of Dante through Shelley and Byron. So Dante was just there. Also, Dante was there as a kind of part of the structure of his thought, the structure of the structure of the canon. Lawrence was also raised to be very deeply religious. And so the whole idea of, you know, hell and purgatory and paradise was just a natural, instinctive part of his thinking. So the structure of the book came to me very organically. The book is about Lawrence's middle 10 years, between the ages of 30 and 40. And it begins with the burning of the rainbow in 1915 and ends with Lawrence's realization that he was dying of tuberculosis in Mexico in 1925. And I structured the book into three parts. The first part is called Inferno, and the second part is Purgatory, and the third part is Paradise. And that's actually because that's Lawrence's language. So the deeper I read into Lawrence, the more I realized that this pattern was there. He saw his life very much. He always saw his life as a piece of art. He talked about his life as being as much a piece of art as his writing was a piece of art. And he always described himself as a mythical figure. He had no identification with other human beings, which is why he could be so cruel. He saw himself as a figure of myth. He saw himself as David in the Bible, as King David. He saw himself as Jesus. He saw himself as Dante. You know, he was a man on a pilgrimage through his life. Now, the language of Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise is everywhere. Lawrence was born in a colliery town, as I've said, where his father was a coal miner. His father went to the underworld every day. In fact, every man that Lawrence ever met worked in the underworld. And Lawrence called it the underworld, you know, because he romanticized his life. And so he thought it was completely normal for him that his father in the morning would go down under, the women would stay on top. And during the war years, he started to describe the England of the First World War as like an inferno as well. He said he was completely trapped in this inferno. And the inferno language just gets more and more and more intense in his letters. And I see Women in Love as very much his infernal novel. It's packed with images from Dante's Inferno. Then after the war, he can finally get out into Italy. And the first place he goes to is Dante's birthplace. He goes to Florence. And at that point, he starts writing about Dante in this crazy school history book he wrote called Movements in Modern European History. And he says, you know, of course, you know, Dante didn't like paradise. He liked the hate. He liked the hate of the Inferno. You know, the rest of it was boring for him. And so as he's moving out of the Inferno, he's beginning to realize that hate is what fuels him. He doesn't really want love. And Pound, I was very struck by something that Ezra Pound said, which was that all of the post-war years were purgatorial. The whole world was in a state of purgatory after the First World War. And I described Lawrence's time in Italy as his purgatorial period, in preparation for going to Paradise, which is America. And he calls America Paradise. I mean, literally, that's what he calls America. All his poems about America are a description of paradise. And in the same way that Dante can't go straight to paradise in the Inferno, he has to take a detour down to, in the Divine Comedy, he can't go straight to paradise. He has to take a detour down the Inferno into Purgatory. Lawrence has this huge detour getting to America. And I thought it's very, very striking that he's identifying himself with this other exile. Dante was also an exile and also felt the brutal cruelty of the Florentine state. When he was forced to wander the world. Lawrence also forced to wander the world, feeling the brutal cruelty of the English state. And then Lawrence did this great Dante-esque act, which was to throw all of his friends into hell. So all of Lawrence's friends and enemies turn up in his novels and they're all punished. And one of the things that is most engaging, I think everyone thinks about the Inferno, is the way in which Dante punishes both real people and fictional people by putting them in the seventh circle or whatever. So it was a structure that I thought was very much there, and whether it was conscious or unconscious, I don't know, but I do feel that Lawrence had to see his life as symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
He
and
couldn't.
you noticed something. You had another insight that kind of bore out this Dantean trope, which was everywhere, whenever you would go to different places to see where Lawrence had lived, you realized he lived at the top. And
Yeah.
heights, right? He was always moving upward in the course of the period you focus on. He was moving up topographically. And I thought that was a very striking sort of insight.
I've never done this with a book before, but I did some Richard Holmes footstepping. You know, Richard Holmes, a kind of method biographer who always says you have to go everywhere your subject goes. And I'd never tried that before, but I thought, okay, I will. And started off with kind of Lawrence's birthplace, which was on a slope of a hill at the bottom of the hill. And his family gradually moved up to the top of the hill. And then everywhere Lawrence lived in London was also at the top of the hill. And then I followed Lawrence around Italy and thought, of course, he's always going to have the house that's hanging off the precipice. And it was the same in Capri. You find the kind of building he lived in and thought it has to be the top floor. Of course it was. Sicily, top floor, everything. He always went for the heights. His journey was upwards. It wasn't a horizontal life, it was a vertical life. And so if you look at the kind of just the degree to which he climbs, his ashes are buried 8,000 feet above sea level in the Lawrence Memorial Chapel in the Rocky Mountains, which means that he starts from the underworld and ends, he goes straight up like that. And I thought, God, that's really wonderful. And so that image of rising is there in all of his poems. He talks about social rising, but also symbolic rising. And of course, he chose for himself the symbol of the phoenix, bird who goes whoosh.
Mm. And he didn't actually sort of fetishize writing as an act, right? Writing was just an act among acts for Lawrence, which is an amazing thing because, well, perhaps it's not amazing because there is a way in which it seems extraordinarily natural for him, but it just kind of flowed out of him. And I was reading, you know, you would quote from a letter or you would suggest a story. And I remember you're remarking that The Prussian Soldier was one of the best short stories in English. And I thought, well, now I've got to read that. So I got a copy. And I was absolutely blown away by how visionary it was. It was like reading Blake, but it was like the physical descriptions were visionary, but also the psychic descriptions. But the whole atmosphere of the story itself was in this utterly uncharted realm. I'd never read anything like it before. It was so much better than the novels that I'd read. And I came away feeling like I had a lot to discover in Lawrence, but to read that he could write that way and not think of writing as anything different than washing the dishes or hemming the curtains was amazing to me. I mean, he was truly strange in that way. And I guess what my next question for you is, what do you feel like drove him to write? What was the mechanism that drove him to write? What was the main spur?
I think his sense of himself as a very great man. And this is something that Jessie Chambers says as well in her memoir. She said that the moment that Lawrence kind of changed, Lawrence split into self one and self two, was when, and it was through Blake. He said that in his reading of Blake, he'd realized that Blake had a good, honest, working class wife behind him. And he said, I've realized, Jessie, that every great man needs a woman behind him, and I want you to be the woman behind me. And what she realized then wasn't just, you know, the minimalism of, you know, that she had been put behind him rather than by his side, but that he had a very powerful and destructive sense of his own greatness. He believed that he was, that he had a calling. And I think this is the same with a lot of lot of geniuses. It's quite weird, I think, to be a genius. And Lawrence was very, very aware of his separateness. So I think that I think he knew he had a calling. He felt he was a prophet. He felt he had something to tell the world because he was born a poor man like Jesus. And he started to look more and more like Christ as well. And, you know, and he saw his mother, obviously, as this virgin, you know, and he wrote a lot about his mother as a virgin. And so he saw himself as someone who was going to be martyred. And as he was more and more martyred, you know, he was shunned in the way that Jesus was shunned. He did see himself as a religious figure. So I think there was that, and I think also it was the sense of dying. He was he had so much to say and so little time. But his writing came out fully formed. There wasn't an early Lawrence where he wasn't writing very well. I mean, he started good and actually, I couldn't say he started good and he stayed good. He started good and he got very bad.
Now, so he rejected Jessie Chambers, but he went for a different sort of woman altogether in Frieda. And perhaps you can talk a bit about what he saw in Frieda, which was in previous biographies a bit of a mystery. No one has previously sort of done justice to Frieda. What is your theory of Frieda's role? For instance, if you think of her as the antithesis of the Jessie Chambers, or is she, or what did she do? Because I'm having a sense now in terms of the hypersexuality of Frieda and the sort of pure bodily function of Frieda, that she gave Lawrence a sense of health. Like, here's a body I can kind of inhabit or have as a kind of double, and my dying tuberculotic body can have a sort of way out, a kind of vehicle. I can latch on to Frieda as an alternative body. Does that sound right?
That sounds absolutely right. Yes, I think at the point of Frieda for Lawrence was that Frieda was body, and that I don't mean that lightly. I mean, Lawrence totally believed in the body. This was the heart of his philosophy, that the body contains an intelligence that only medieval people really understood in his version of history. The body contained a deep intelligence that had been repressed, and we were now far too cerebral. And so what he wanted Frieda to be was this mindless sex machine, and Frieda was very happy to be that for him. Lawrence had to live inside Blakean oppositions. Opposition is true friendship. And so the fact that he was spindly and intellectual was absolutely perfect, because Frieda was bigger and got bigger and bigger and bigger and had no intellect at all. And so he needed to have that friction with her. She was like his father. You know, his father was a man of no words and physical power, and Frieda represented that type for him. Other things that were important about Frieda were that she was already married. For Lawrence, who lived his life in an Oedipal triangle, it was vital for him to be able to break up a marriage. And Frieda's husband had been his tutor at university. And so that was a kind of triumph. She was older than him and she had children. She had 3 children who she left for Lawrence, not happily. I mean, Lawrence told her to leave her children for him. And so he needed to be the favorite child, if you like. So Frieda kind of fitted the psychological type. Frieda also had, I mean, it's very hard for us to kind of understand Frieda now because she was so German, and she represented a kind of a German bohemian new age. I mean, she had a double life when she met Lawrence. She was living as a kind of suburban housewife in Nottingham, married to a university lecturer and looking after her children. But every year she went back to Germany and stayed with her sister, where she practiced free love. She shared a lover with her sister. She shared a lover with her best friend. One of her lovers was an anarchist who was in prison at the moment. And so Lawrence was absolutely thrilled by all this. He had, he'd been used to kind of innocence like Jessie Chambers, and this woman of the world, you know, he was blown away by it. And Frieda became, well, she said she was his muse. She said she taught him all he knew. And I think that, you know, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but she definitely released something that he had been looking for. She became the woman behind the man, and the great man. And when he met Frieda, his writing completely changed. Had he not met Frieda, he wouldn't be the kind of the literary killing machine that we see now. But also, I mean, there wouldn't be so many flaws in the novels. I think that, you know, the novels get really, really bad because of Frieda's influence as well.
But in a way, for you, he's unimaginable without Frieda.
Yeah, and it's one of these, they're a difficult couple because everyone hates Frieda. So they're like these couples that, you know, where you think love him, hate her, you know, but they're never apart. And Lawrence's friends all couldn't stand Frieda because, you know, because she smoked in his face and he was tubercular and sat with her legs open and said stupid things and talked about sex all the time. And they couldn't work out why he liked her so much. But he was addicted to her. As you say, I mean, she was his body. He lost oxygen when she left the room. So you have to see them as one person.
Do you trace his self-conception as a prophet to Frieda?
Yeah, Frieda wanted him to be a prophet.
So do you think she was the origin of that self-conception?
Yeah, definitely, because she'd been with two very powerful men. In her secret affairs in Germany had been with very, very powerful men who, one of whom, Otto Gross, had been a kind of one of the pioneers of psychoanalysis, and a kind of and Freud's kind of right-hand man. And she saw him as a prophet, and she wanted Lawrence to be as great as Otto Gross had been. And so Lawrence was really kind of burdened by Frieda's sexual past, and tried to make himself exciting enough for her.
Yeah, he was intimidated by that, and who wouldn't be? I mean, this guy was a kind of raging genius in his own right. Now, let's talk a bit about the title Burning Man in this respect. I love it. It made me laugh, and as an American, I thought immediately of the festival, the techno, you know, rave in the desert of Nevada every, you know, annual, right? And I thought that was a funny pun, but the more I thought about it and read the book, the more sense it made, because I think Lawrence might have gone to Burning Man, or Lawrence might have arranged for a utopian community. You know, there's a very strong utopian communitarian thrust to Burning Man, that festival. It's the most idealistic thing happening in America for the past 20 years, or however long it's been in existence, maybe 30 years now. And I think Lawrence would have been very curious about it. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about this reflexive impulse he had to form a community, to say, let's join households, let's live in a communitarian way. I found that so funny because he seemed like such a, in many ways, a classic loner genius, and yet he always wanted to merge. Talk a little about his utopianism.
Yes. Well, Lawrence had a horror of bourgeois domesticity because of or domesticity of any form. He had a horror of families, a horror of living alone with his wife. He always wanted to be in a community, but it wasn't a community of equals. It was a community in which he was the leader. And you're absolutely right about Burning Man. He'd have loved Burning Man. It was the whole festival culture was Lawrence culture. You know, he'd have been so moved, wept with joy that the world became like that, allowed for that. So within minutes of meeting anyone, Lawrence would ask them to join his community, which was called Renamin. He called it Renamin, and it was based really, I think, on what Wordsworth and Coleridge were going to set up on the Saskatchewan River. Do you remember when they were going to have their ideal community as well? It was people would be kind of naked a lot of the time. You know, they grow their own vegetables. You live off grid. He was an Edwardian New Age hippie. but he was also a kind of uptight Puritan. And he didn't, so he'd meet people at parties and he'd say instantly, will you join me? And they all said, God, that's such an amazing idea, but nobody did. Nobody did. Until right at the end, he had one person join him, one little fan, and that was Dorothy Brett with her ear trumpet. And she went with him. But by then, Lawrence was a raving tyrant. But you have to hand it to him. He wanted to live differently. He urgently wanted to live differently. And we understand that now, when everyone wants to live off grid. Everyone's trying to find a way of getting away from the future, getting away from the city. We're all disturbed by what's happening with industrialization, mechanization, computerization. Lawrence couldn't stand it. He wanted emptiness, purity. He wanted the Nevada desert.
And speaking of which, he got very close to that with going to Taos and living with Mabel Dodge Lewin. Maybe you can talk a bit about that period, which is the end of your book, and her role in his life. And there's a way in which she's duplicating Frieda. And so I found her confusing, like in terms of a psychic pattern for him. I didn't understand the triangulation that was happening there, but I thought, but the drama between those two women, right when he and Frieda arrive in Taos, maybe you can talk a bit about that episode.
Yeah, so I didn't know how much I would like Mabel Dodge until I started reading her own memoirs and researching her. I think she was absolutely magnificent woman. And like Frieda, she put up with so much from Lawrence. So she invited Lawrence to come and join her in Taos. And it was an extraordinary piece of almost telepathy. Now, she read one article by Lawrence in the Dial, in an American journal, and she thought, this is who I want. I want him to come and live with me and be my writer in residence in my own community here, where she was trying to get close to kind of the Native Americans, and she had a lover who was a Native American. And this is at exactly the moment when Lawrence most wanted to do this. He wanted to go to the American Southwest, and he wanted to live in exactly the same way. And so it was bizarre that she invited him. But of course, he had to go to Ceylon first and then Australia, because there was this huge detour. He was frightened of going to America. He was frightened of the paradise that she represented. And I cast her as his Beatrice, kind of waiting for him. He's terrified because he knows he is going to die there, because that's what happens in paradise. And all of his poems about going to America are about America being this grave. But he gets to Mabel Dodge's wonderful house that she's built, her adobe kind of mansion, and she wants him to write about her as a heroine. And he realizes instantly that he's deeply irritated by her and doesn't want to be owned by her. But this is what Lawrence realizes with everyone, that he cannot accept kindness. He felt it was a form of being patronized, which it sort of was. And so immediately Mabel Dodge became his enemy, and they started this fight to the death between the two of them, and it was extraordinary to watch. And it was played out in his writing and in her letters and in her journals. And Frieda sat and kind of mused over it, feeling kind of jealous and displaced, because Mabel Dodge was like her. She was a big, hearty, physical woman, and who actively wanted to seduce Lawrence and take her away from Frieda. And so Frieda was very threatened by it. It was the drama of the whole thing kind of beggar belief that this is what passed for normal life.
And ultimately, how did that resolve itself? Frieda won, no? Frieda won.
The novel that Lawrence started writing a novel about Mabel Dodge, and it was going to be his great American novel. He wrote the great Australian novel when he'd been in Australia for 10 days. So he thought, why can't I write the great American novel, and organize it around Mabel Dodge? This is exactly what she wanted. And I think it would have been, there's only a fragment of the novel left, but which I which I write about, I think it would have been terrific. This is what Mabel wanted. Frieda didn't want it, and so the whole thing was put on hold. And instead, everything Lawrence wrote while he was in America was against Mabel. Mm. It was to kind of, it was to disempower her. Even the Hopi snake dance, he was taken there by Mabel, and he kind of mocked it in his first version to kind of to make her look sort of a ridiculous rich woman fetishizing Native American customs, which of course she was.
But you do a good job. You do a good job of establishing that she was on the right side of history with all of that. She may have had her excesses and her romanticizing, but God forbid that she had not been there to protect some of that. I want to talk a bit about TB. Before I go to that, I wanted to invite people to post questions to me on the chat if you have any. I think it will go just to me, but it might go to everyone. In any case, please ask questions now and we will try to take them. So I mean, when I was reading this book, this biography, I was really chilled by the way you handled TB, because I think you get at how profoundly taboo it was. Its relationship to syphilis at the time. There's that really strange scene with Tony Lewin where he says, I'll let you tell that story. But in general, there was a sense of a barely established stay of execution hovering over Lawrence, which gave him, his writing and his life, all of this urgency. But the place of TB in the culture was strange in general, but also within his life, it had such profound, he was so good at repressing it as a reality. And it's very sad and kind of, but you know, reading it during COVID also, I was thinking a lot about COVID-19, TB, pandemics. Anyway, maybe you can kind of just get at some of that. It's very rich.
Yeah, so I think what we have to remember about TB is that it was seen, it was a taboo illness. It was seen as equivalent to AIDS. It was seen as a filthy illness, and more or less kind of sexually transmitted because it passed through kissing or whatever. So Lawrence kept it a secret that he had TB. He kept it a secret almost from himself. He died every Christmas, effectively. He was so ill in the winters that he could barely breathe, and he was kind of pulled out of it by spring. And so he was reborn every spring, which again made him feel very Christ-like, as if he'd been resurrected. And when he got to New Mexico, which was a kind of a massive sanatorium for TB sufferers. This was the place in the world where all the TB sufferers were going, because the altitude was so fantastic. And this must have been part of his reason for wanting to go there, but he would bury that reason, because the irony of a man who worshipped the power of the body, having a body that was failing him every day of his life, was too great. When he gets there, what he discovers is that Mabel has syphilis, and that the whole of Taos Pueblo is syphilitic, that the Westerners have spread syphilis around the Pueblo. And so he's come to kind of worship these people who are supposed to be kind of native sexual innocents, kind of no disease has touched the Taos Pueblo, but there's syphilis everywhere and TB everywhere. He and Mabel could have wiped out the whole population of New Mexico had they wanted to. They were both so contagious. And there was the moment what you're describing is Mabel kept her syphilis a secret, Lawrence kept his TB a secret, but they were both such enemies. A few years in, they both knew each other's secrets. And at one point, Mabel and her then husband, Tony Lewin, are having a picnic with Lawrence up in his ranch, which Mabel gave him. And Lawrence says something about syphilis. He says, "Why what exactly is syphilis then? And Tony Lewin says to him, a little bit like TB, I think.
Right. I felt like you had, by that point in the book, acquired a kind of protective attitude toward Lawrence, which comes out, at least this is how I read it. You tell me if I'm wrong. There is that scene with the two robust Danes who are, I think they're artists, they're painters, and they go on these big hikes, and Lawrence is kind of trying to keep up with them as they go on these kind of very manly hikes up the mountain. And the Danes are, in a letter, kind of mocking Lawrence for his pigeon-breasted kind of frailty. And this elicits something in you, I felt at that point in the book, where you're saying, you take a moment to put the Danes in their place. Tell me about that, like, feeling you had toward Lawrence and his frailty.
It felt to me, you're right, I was very, very angry with those Danes. I felt it was fantastically cruel of them, that here was Lawrence, a kind of tubercular man, very, very ill and frail, living in the Rocky Mountains, where it was so cold, the snow was so deep, they had to break ice in order to get water. He should not have been living like this. And he was living with these two, he'd asked these two Danes, these strapping young men, to live with him because they had a car. And he could only have this existence with their help. And they spent their whole time, rather than kind of looking after him, mocking him. And they go, as you say, on these huge hikes. And Lawrence just simply couldn't keep up. And in the memoir, that one of them wrote a memoir of Lawrence, where he talks the whole time about how fantastically strong he was as a man and how weak Lawrence was. And he describes looking down the mountain and seeing Lawrence's tiny little speck, at the bottom, kind of catching his breath, and sort of mocks him for it. You think, God, how dare you mock him? And then he talks about going swimming with Lawrence, and he describes himself as an Olympic standard swimmer. And Lawrence wasn't a good swimmer, didn't have good enough lungs to be a good swimmer, and talks about his kind of weedy little body. And I then did pause in the book to comment on the fact that every single man Lawrence came in contact with commented on his weedy little body. No, what other writer has had his naked body scrutinized as much as Lawrence had? Did anyone ever say anything? I mean, I suppose not many writers have had their naked body seen as much as Lawrence had, but it is quite strange that he is, that his absence of, his failure of masculinity is the butt of so many people's jokes. And of course, the more he idealized, macho, silent he-men, the more, I mean, it's painful and poignant, isn't it, that he was so frail himself, but still worshipped the male form. Well,
speaking of masculinity, there's a question about Lawrence's interest in homosexuality and gay themes, and I was very impressed with his championing of E.M. Forster's Morris when it came out. And I think he said to Forster, he said, you should just go with this, publish this, don't be afraid. And I thought that was extraordinarily progressive of him about homosexuality, no?
Lawrence was all over the place about homosexuality. He was all over the place with everything. I mean, for every view, he had an opposing view. I mean, he was kind of right-wing and left-wing and feminist and anti-feminist. On the one hand, he was completely fascinated by homosexuality and all forms of kind of male intimacy, just friendship, completely fascinated him. And on the other hand, he was absolutely horrified by it. He believed that the novel should go as far as it possibly could in terms of exploring same-sex attraction. He felt that this, again, because it was one body speaking to another body.
Right.
And so he did have excitingly radical views about what the novel should and could be doing, and what men and women should and could be doing with themselves in private. But he couldn't really bring them both together. He was I mean, there are as many moments of homophobia in Lawrence as there are kind of sort of enlightened perspectives.
So there's a question about Lawrence's painting, and I remember I think the general consensus on Lawrence's painting is pretty terrible, but his view of it was that it was great. Not only great, but it was a consummation of Western tradition. What do you, I guess my question is, what do you make of the myopia there? Like, what do you make of his artistic failure to recognize his own mediocrity with regard to the painting, and the relationship of that failure to the writing, which was so great?
Well, I think that it's very interesting. I mean, that he valued his painting as much as he valued his writing. The paintings are actually hard to look at. They're on display in a hotel in Taos Plaza, and you go in and you pay your $1, and the curtain is drawn back, and you go, ah! I mean, horrible to look at, and then you can't get the image of them out of your mind. But no, he thought they were terrific. But he also couldn't tell his good writing from his bad. So I mean, he had no idea that he destroyed so many of his novels by having a Laurentian hero come in and mansplain for 10 pages about something. He had no idea that that had ruined the book. I mean, what you describe as the pure perfection of the Prussian officer,
yeah.
The transcendent beauty of his short stories is so extraordinary, but he couldn't see that they were any better than the kind of the lumpen late novels like the Plumed Serpent. And the reason the short stories are so good is because he doesn't give himself room to spoil them.
I see. So what do you make of his? But what do you make of his critical acumen with regard to American literary tradition and the American classics? Because that seems like an aesthetic. That's not. I mean, in a way, what he does there is not purely aesthetic as an assessment. It's more mythopoetic, right? So Melville is mythopoeticized. He's not saying at the level of the sentence Melville is great, right?
It is incredible what he does with American literature, but there are two books here. So when his first studies in classic American literature, the first collection of essays were written when he was in Cornwall during the war. He'd never been to America, and he'd only read a couple of American novels, but he had this vision of America, as everyone, you know, like all the kind of pilgrims before they left, he had this vision of America. And so he wrote these very idealized, I think they're much better than the final published version. And then when he got to America, instantly, the minute he'd settled with Mabel Dodge and decided not to write the novel about her, not to write the great American novel featuring Mabel Dodge Lewin, he rewrote Studies in Classic American Literature, this time infusing it with his deep disappointment that America had let him down. So they became angry, staccato, angry, ranting, very funny, and kind of crazy and off the wall. But he wanted the American reader to recognize that they had something extraordinary on their hands in these 19th century texts that he felt, quite rightly, had been treated as children's literature and brushed under the carpet. And he said these texts, like Moby Dick, come straight from the unconscious. They come from the unconscious of the country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is an entirely new voice, and we have to listen. We have to listen, and so it was very exciting.
Oh yeah, no, I get that. That's electrically exciting, those essays. Now we have time for one more question, and this one's coming. This is very much on the continuum with what we were just talking about with regard to the criticism. This is from Mary Dearborn. She says,
hello.
You said the novels should be at the periphery of his body of work. What do you think should be in the center? What should we?
Well, I do think that Studies in Classic American Literature should be absolutely at the center. I mean, some people would say it is at the center anyway. It's never not been, and that might be the case in America. I don't know how seriously those essays are taken in American schools and universities, because they're not known here. They're not known in the UK at all. I also think it's extraordinary that Lawrence's plays, and he wrote plays before he wrote anything else. He wrote plays as kind of as a late teenager. It's extraordinary that those aren't put on more, because they are perfect. And I really mean that. I mean, George Bernard Shaw said, "I wish I could write dialogue as Lawrence wrote dialogue. With me, you always hear the sound of the typewriter." And Richard Eyre has put them on occasionally to London audiences who just kind of gasp at how good they are. That he's just got the tension of his own childhood home, this collier's cottage with a father who's despised and a mother who's socially aspiring and a son who's reading Swinburne, and everyone giggles when the father drinks his tea out of the saucer of his cup. So he's I think he's doing something completely unprecedented. I mean, there was Edwardian drama was interesting. It was an interesting scene anyway, but Lawrence was doing something completely unprecedented in 1909-10 with his plays. Why don't we know them more?
Well, I have a feeling we're going to get to know them.
Oh, I hope.
Well, thank you, Frances, for the book and for taking the time to meet with us today. The book is Burning Man, and that was terrific. I really want to thank you, and thank Shelby and Kai for helping us put this on. And
thank you so much for having me. It's been so nice to see you again.
My pleasure completely. Have a great evening.
And you too.
Bye, everyone.